was offered like livestock to a ruthless Viking as payment for a crime she didn't commit. But what happened behind the doors of his longhouse that night, no one could have predicted. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The wind howled across the fjord like the cry of a dying wolf, carrying with it the salt and spray of the Norwegian Sea. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain, casting long shadows over the cluster of wooden longhouses that made up the settlement of Ravensfjord. The year was 872, and the coastal village clung to the rocky shoreline like a barnacle to a ship's hull, its people hardened by generations of harsh winters and harder lives. Smoke rose from the chimneys in thin, gray columns, only to be torn apart by the relentless wind that seemed to never sleep in this unforgiving land. In the largest longhouse at the center of the settlement, a fire crackled in the central hearth, its flames dancing and casting flickering shadows on the carved wooden beams overhead. The hall was filled with men, their voices a low rumble of conversation and argument, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter or the clang of a drinking horn against the wooden tables. These were the warriors and farmers of Ravensfjord, men who had survived countless raids and brutal winters, their faces weathered like the cliffs that surrounded their home. At the head of the hall sat Jarl Thorfinn Eriksson, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. He was massive, his shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, his arms thick with muscle earned through years of swinging an axe in battle and labor. His hair was the color of dark honey, worn long and tied back with a leather cord, and his beard was full and braided in the traditional manner. But it was his eyes that truly marked him as different from other men. They were pale blue, almost colorless, like ice reflecting the winter sky, and they held a coldness that made even the bravest warriors hesitate before meeting his gaze. Scars crossed his face and arms, each one a testament to battles fought and won, and when he moved, it was with the controlled power of a predator. Thorfinn had earned his fearsome reputation through blood and steel. At 28 winters, he had already led more successful raids than men twice his age, bringing back wealth and slaves from the Saxon lands across the sea. His crew was loyal to the point of fanaticism, for he shared the spoils fairly and never asked them to take risks he would not take himself. But there was something else about Thorfinn that made men fear him, something beyond his physical prowess or tactical brilliance. It was the stillness in him, the way he could look at a man and see not a person, but an obstacle to be removed or a tool to be used. He had killed his first man at 14, defending his father's farm from raiders, and the ease with which he had done it had troubled even his own kin. Now Thorfinn sat in his carved chair, one hand wrapped around a horn of mead, the other resting on the pommel of his sword. His expression was unreadable as he listened to the man standing before him, a wiry farmer named Dag, who twisted his cap in his hands and spoke in a voice that shook with barely contained emotion. "Jarl Thorfinn, I beg you to reconsider," Dag pleaded, his weathered face pale despite the warmth of the hall. "My family has served yours faithfully for 3 generations. My father fought beside your father in the raid on Lindisfarne. Surely there must be another way to settle this debt." Thorfinn took a long drink from his horn, his ice-blue eyes never leaving Dag's face. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and measured, carrying easily through the hall despite its quietness. "Your son stole 3 breeding ewes from my flock, Dag. 3 ewes that would have produced lambs for years to come. He was caught red-handed by my herdsman and admitted his guilt. The law is clear on this matter. He is young and foolish," Dag said desperately. "He acted without thinking, driven by hunger, because our own sheep died in the winter storms. I have already given you 2 of my best rams as compensation, everything I have left. What more can I offer?" A cruel smile touched Thorfinn's lips, though it never reached his eyes. "You have something else, Dag. Something far more valuable than rams or sheep." The hall fell silent. Even the crackling of the fire seemed to diminish as every man present understood what the Jarl was suggesting. Dag's face went from pale to ashen, and he took a step backward as if physically struck. "No," he whispered. "Not Freya. She is innocent in this matter. She had nothing to do with my son's crime. The law states that when a man cannot pay his debts, his family must pay in his stead." Thorfinn replied, his tone as cold and implacable as the winter sea. "Your son's theft has cost you more than livestock, Dag. It has cost you honor. The only way to restore it is through blood or bond." Since you have no more livestock to give, and I have no interest in your son's worthless blood, I will take your daughter instead." Freya stood in the shadows near the back of the hall, having been summoned there by one of Thorfinn's men shortly before her father's arrival. She was 19 winters old, tall and slender like a young birch tree, with hair the color of autumn wheat that fell in thick waves past her shoulders. Her eyes were a warm brown, intelligent and observant, framed by dark lashes that seemed too delicate for this harsh northern world. Despite the rough wool of her dress and the calluses on her hands from years of hard work, there was something undeniably beautiful about her, a grace in the way she moved and held herself that spoke of inner strength. She had known this moment was coming since the day her foolish brother Olaf had been caught with the stolen sheep. She had seen the fear in her father's eyes, heard the whispered conversations between her parents late at night when they thought she was asleep. Her mother had wept, begging her father to find another solution, but Freya had known there was none. Their family had nothing left to give, and the Jarl's reputation for ruthlessness was well earned. Men who crossed Thorfinn Eriksson did not live long, and those who could not pay their debts learned quickly that his mercy was as cold as the northern winds. Now, as she stepped forward from the shadows, every eye in the hall turned to her. She kept her head high and her expression composed, refusing to show the terror that gripped her heart like an icy fist. She had spent her entire life in Ravensfjord, helping her mother with the household tasks, tending the sheep, weaving cloth on the long winter nights. She had dreamed, as all young women did, of marriage to a good man, of children and a home of her own. But those dreams had died with her brother's stupidity. Thorfinn's gaze locked onto her, and Freya felt as if she were being evaluated like a horse at market. His ice-blue eyes traveled from her face down to her feet and back up again, taking in every detail with a calculating coldness that made her skin crawl. She forced herself to meet his stare, to not look away or show weakness. If she was to be given to this man as payment for her family's debt, she would at least face it with dignity. "She will do," Thorfinn said finally, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "She is young and healthy, and she appears to have more intelligence than her brother. Yes, Dag, your daughter will serve as payment for your debt. She will come to my household and serve me in whatever capacity I require." The implication in his words was clear to everyone present, and Freya felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She was being given to him like a slave, to be used however he saw fit. There would be no marriage ceremony, no honor in this transaction. She would belong to him completely with no rights and no recourse. Dag fell to his knees, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Please, Jarl Thorfinn, I beg you, take me instead. Make me your thrall. I will work until I die to pay this debt, but please leave my daughter in peace." "Your daughter is worth far more than you, old man," Thorfinn replied dismissively. "She is young and strong, while you are already breaking down like a rotted fence post. No, the deal is made. Your daughter will come with me tonight, and your debt will be considered paid. Be grateful that I am this generous. Many Jarls would have taken your son's hand for thievery or his life." He stood then, his massive frame unfolding from the chair with surprising grace for a man of his size. He was even more imposing standing up, towering over most of the men in the hall. He gestured to one of his warriors, a scarred veteran named Sten. "Bring her to my chambers and see that she is given proper clothing. She looks like a beggar in those rags." Freya's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but accept this fate. But she knew it would be pointless. Where could she run in Ravensfjord that Thorfinn's men would not find her? And if she ran, what would happen to her family? The Jarl could easily decide that their debt was not paid and demand more, or worse, take his anger out on her parents or her stupid brother. So instead of running, she walked forward with measured steps, keeping her spine straight and her eyes forward. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she passed her father, still kneeling on the floor with his face in his hands, she wanted to stop, to comfort him, to tell him it would be all right. But the words stuck in her throat because they would be lies. Nothing about this was all right. Sten took her by the arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and led her from the hall. The last thing she heard before the heavy door closed behind her was her father's anguished sobs, a sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. The night air was cold and sharp, biting through the thin wool of her dress, as Sten guided her across the muddy courtyard to another longhouse. smaller than the great hall but still impressive in its construction. This was Thorfinn's personal dwelling, and as they entered, Freya was struck by the richness of it. Furs covered the walls for warmth, and carved chests lined the perimeter, no doubt filled with the spoils of raids. A fire burned in the central hearth, and oil lamps hung from the beams, filling the space with warm, golden light. "Wait here," Sten instructed, releasing her arm. He disappeared into a back room and returned a moment later with a bundle of clothing. "The Jarl wants you presentable. Put these on and wait for him." He left her alone then, and Freya stood in the middle of the room, holding the bundle of clothes and trying to process everything that had happened. Her entire life had been upended in the space of an hour. This morning she had been a free woman, poor but with her dignity intact. Now she was property, belonging to the most feared man in Ravensfjord. She unfolded the clothing Sten had given her, and found a dress of fine wool, dyed a deep blue that would have cost more than her family earned in a year. There was also a linen underdress, soft leather shoes, and even a cloak lined with fox fur. The quality of these items told her something she had not expected. Thorfinn meant for her to look like she belonged to his household, not like a common thrall. Was this vanity on his part, wanting his possession to reflect well on him? Or was there something else at play? She changed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar fastenings. The dress fit her well, suggesting that Thorfinn had estimated her size with surprising accuracy during his cold evaluation of her in the hall. The thought made her uncomfortable in ways she could not quite name. As she finished dressing, the door opened and Thorfinn entered, ducking his head slightly to clear the doorframe. He had removed his heavy cloak and the weapons belt that had hung at his waist in the hall, but he was no less imposing for it. If anything, without the trappings of war, his sheer physical presence was even more apparent. His tunic was made of fine linen, dyed a dark red, and his arms were bare, showing the intricate patterns of scars and old wounds that covered his skin. He looked at her for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes unreadable. Then he walked to a table near the hearth and poured mead from a jug into 2 horns. He held one out to her. "Drink," he commanded. "You look like you are about to faint." Freya's first instinct was to refuse, but her throat was dry and her hands were shaking. She took the horn and drank deeply, the sweet, strong mead burning down her throat and spreading warmth through her chest. It helped slightly to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Thorfinn watched her drink, then gestured to a bench near the fire. "Sit, we need to establish the terms of your service." Freya sat, clutching the horn in both hands like a lifeline. Thorfinn remained standing, looming over her, and for a moment she thought he was trying to intimidate her further. But then she realized he was simply too restless to sit, his energy barely contained even in this moment of apparent calm. "You understand why you are here?" he said. It was not a question, but Freya nodded anyway. "Your father's debt is paid by your service to me. How long that service lasts depends entirely on you." This surprised her enough that she looked up at him, meeting those cold eyes directly. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I did not take you to be my thrall, girl," Thorfinn replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "Thralls are for manual labor, for the mindless tasks that free men do not wish to perform. You, however, interest me for different reasons." Freya's heart hammered in her chest. She knew what men wanted from women like her, women with no power and no choice. She braced herself for what was coming next, determined not to beg or plead. But Thorfinn's next words caught her completely off guard. "I need someone who can read and write the runes. Someone who can keep records of my holdings and manage my household when I'm away on raids. Your father mentioned once that you had learned these skills from the Christian monk who came through here 5 winters ago. Is this true?" Freya stared at Thorfinn, her mind struggling to process his words. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this was not among them. She had prepared herself for violence, for humiliation, for the loss of everything that made her who she was. But instead, he was asking about her ability to read and write runes. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Brother Cuthbert spent 2 winters in Ravensfjord before he continued his journey north. He taught me to read and write both the old runes and the Latin letters. My father thought it was foolish, but my mother encouraged it. She said knowledge was a gift that could never be taken away." A bitter laugh escaped her lips at the irony of those words. Everything else had been taken from her tonight, but at least she still had the knowledge locked in her mind. Thorfinn's expression shifted slightly. something that might have been approval flickering across his harsh features. Your mother was wiser than your father, it seems. Good. You will manage my household records, keep track of provisions and trade goods, and handle correspondence with other jarls when necessary. In return, you will have your own quarters, proper clothing, and enough food to keep you healthy and strong. You will not be treated as a thrall, but as a member of my household. He paused, taking a long drink from his own horn before continuing. However, make no mistake about your position here, Freya. You belong to me. You will do as I command, when I command it. If you attempt to run, I will find you and your family will pay the price. If you betray me, the consequences will be severe. But if you serve me faithfully and prove your worth, you will be treated with respect. Do you understand? Freya nodded slowly, her mind racing. This was better than she had feared. Far better. She would not be used as a mere plaything or worked to death as a thrall. But neither was she free. She was still his property, still bound to him by her family's debt and his will. The gilded cage was more comfortable than she had expected, but it was a cage nonetheless. I understand, Jarl Thorfinn, she said quietly. I will serve you faithfully. Good. He set down his horn and moved toward the door. Your quarters are through that door on the left. You will find everything you need there. Tomorrow you will begin your duties. Steen will show you where the records are kept and what needs to be done. For tonight, rest. You have had a difficult day. He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a solid thud that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Freya sat motionless for a long moment, still clutching the horn of mead, trying to understand what had just happened. She had been prepared for the worst, and instead she had been given, what? A position? A purpose? It felt surreal, like a dream that she would wake from at any moment to find herself back in her father's house, her life unchanged. But this was no dream. The weight of the fine wool dress against her skin, the warmth of the fire, the lingering taste of mead on her tongue, all of it was real. Her life had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back. She stood on shaking legs and made her way to the door Thorfinn had indicated. Beyond it was a small room, barely large enough for the narrow bed, a wooden chest, and a small table with an oil lamp. But it was private, separate from the main hall, and the bed had actual furs and woolen blankets instead of the thin straw mattress she had slept on her entire life. It was, she realized with a mixture of shame and relief, better quarters than she had ever had before. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed against her face, and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of everything that had happened. Tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her cheeks as she wept silently into her palms. She cried for her lost freedom, for her father's anguish, for her mother's fear, for the life she had dreamed of but would never have. She cried until there were no tears left, until she was hollow and exhausted, her eyes swollen and her throat raw. Then she lay down on the soft furs and closed her eyes, willing sleep to come and take her away from this nightmare, even if only for a few hours. Morning came too soon, announced by the harsh cawing of ravens outside her small window. Freya woke feeling as if she had not slept at all, her body heavy and her mind foggy. For a moment she did not remember where she was, and then it all came rushing back with sickening clarity. She forced herself to rise, to splash cold water from the basin on the table onto her face, to braid her hair and make herself presentable. If she was to survive in this new life, she could not afford to show weakness. She had to be strong, had to prove her worth, or else Thorfinn might decide she was not useful after all, and her fate would be far worse. When she emerged from her room, she found Steen waiting for her in the main hall. The scarred warrior nodded in greeting, his expression neither friendly nor hostile, merely professional. The Jarl has already left to inspect the fishing fleet, he informed her. He instructed me to show you the record room and explain what will be expected of you. Follow me. She followed him through the longhouse to a room she had not noticed the night before, tucked away behind a heavy curtain. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves containing wooden tablets, rolls of vellum, and various writing implements. There was a large table in the center, covered with more tablets and scraps of vellum, all marked with runes and calculations. This is where the Jarl keeps all records of his holdings, Sten explained. Trade agreements, tallies of livestock and provisions, records of raids and their spoils, debts owed and debts paid. It has been in poor order since his last steward died 3 moons ago. Old Kolbein kept excellent records, but he was killed during a raid on the Saxon coast. Since then, things have been chaotic. The Jarl needs someone who can restore order to this mess and keep it maintained. Freya looked around the room, taking in the scope of the task before her. It was indeed chaotic, with tablets stacked haphazardly and vellum scrolls mixed together with no apparent organization. But as she examined the records more closely, she could see the underlying system that Kolbein had used, the logic behind his organization. It would take time and effort, but she could restore it. "I can do this," she said, more to herself than to Sten. "It will take several weeks to sort through everything and create a proper system, but I can do it." Sten nodded approvingly. "Good. The Jarl will be pleased. He values efficiency and order, even if he appears to be a man of violence." "Do not be fooled by his reputation, girl. Thorfinn Eriksson is more intelligent than most men give him credit for. That is part of what makes him so dangerous." He left her then to begin her work, and Freya threw herself into the task with a determination born of necessity. She sorted through the tablets and scrolls, organizing them by category and date, making notes on fresh vellum about what she found. The work was tedious and demanding, requiring her full concentration, which was a blessing. While her mind was occupied with tallying sheep and calculating the value of trade goods, she did not have time to dwell on her circumstances or to feel sorry for herself. She worked through the entire day, pausing only briefly when a young thrall girl brought her bread and cheese for her midday meal. The girl, who introduced herself shyly as Runa, seemed curious about Freya, but too intimidated to ask questions. Freya treated her kindly, thanking her for the food and asking her name, which seemed to surprise and please the girl. As the afternoon shadows grew long, Freya became aware of voices outside the record room, the sound of men returning from their day's labors. She heard Thorfinn's deep voice among them, issuing orders and discussing the day's catch. Part of her wanted to hide in the record room to avoid facing him again, but she knew that was cowardly. She was part of his household now, and she would have to get used to his presence. She forced herself to set down her writing implement and step out into the main hall. The space had filled with men, most of them Thorfinn's crew members and household warriors. They were a rough-looking lot, scarred and weathered, but they seemed to be in good spirits, laughing and jesting with each other as they settled around the long tables for the evening meal. Thorfinn stood near the hearth, his massive frame silhouetted against the fire. He was speaking with an older man, gray-haired but still powerful-looking, who wore the silver arm ring of a Hersir, a military commander. As if sensing her presence, Thorfinn turned his head and his ice-blue eyes found her immediately. "Freya," he called out, his voice cutting through the din of conversation. "Come here." Every man in the hall turned to look at her as she crossed the room, and she felt their eyes on her like physical weight. She kept her expression neutral and her step steady, refusing to show the nervousness that churned in her stomach. When she reached Thorfinn's side, he gestured to the older man. "This is Håkon, my Hersir and the captain of my ship. Håkon, this is Freya, my new steward. She will be managing the household records and provisions." Håkon's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile, though it was hard to tell beneath his gray beard. "A woman steward? That is unusual, Jarl Thorfinn. But then, you have never been one to follow tradition when it did not suit you." "Tradition is useful when it serves a purpose," Thorfinn replied. "When it becomes an obstacle, it should be discarded. Freya has the skills I need, and that is all that matters. Any man who has a problem with this arrangement can take it up with me directly." His tone made it clear that taking it up with him would be a very unwise decision. Håkon chuckled and shook his head. "I doubt anyone will be foolish enough to challenge you on this, Jarl. They know better." Thorfinn turned his attention back to Freya. "How did you find the records?" "In poor order, as Sten warned me they would be," Freya replied honestly. "But I have begun sorting through them and establishing a new organizational system. It will take time, but I believe I can have everything properly arranged within 3 weeks." 3 weeks? Thorfinn's eyebrows rose slightly. "Old Kolbein took 2 months to set up his system when he first came to me. Old Kolbein was likely more thorough than I will be," Freya said, "but I am also more motivated. The sooner I prove my worth, the more secure my position becomes." A flash of something that might have been amusement crossed Thorfinn's face. "You are honest, at least. That is refreshing. Most people in your position would be eager to promise whatever I wanted to hear, whether they could deliver it or not." "Lying to you would be foolish," Freya replied. You do not strike me as a man who tolerates fools or liars. You are correct on both counts. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded toward the tables. You will eat with the household. Your place is at the far end of the high table. It is not the position of honor, but it is above the common warriors. Your status is that of a valued member of my household, and others will treat you accordingly. It was a statement, not a request, and the underlying message was clear. Anyone who disrespected her would answer to him. It was protection of a sort, but it also bound her more tightly to him. She was his steward, his possession, and any insult to her was an insult to him. The meal was substantial, far better than the simple fare she was used to at her father's house. There was roasted meat, fresh fish, bread still warm from the oven, cheese and ale. Freya ate mechanically, tasting nothing, aware of the curious glances from the men around her. Some looked at her with obvious interest, others with suspicion, and a few with barely concealed hostility. She ignored them all, keeping her eyes on her plate and her expression neutral. After the meal, as the men settled in for an evening of drinking and storytelling, Thorfinn stood and announced that he would be departing in 3 days for a trading expedition to the south. He would be taking his ship and crew, leaving Håkon in charge of the settlement's defense. He would be gone for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer depending on weather and trade opportunities. Freya felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety at this news. Relief because Thorfinn's absence would give her time to adjust to her new situation without his overwhelming presence constantly reminding her of her captivity. Anxiety because she would be alone in his household, surrounded by his men, with no one to protect her if any of them decided to test the boundaries he had established. As if reading her thoughts, Thorfinn caught her eye across the hall. Freya, a word with you before you retire. She rose and followed him to a quieter corner of the hall, away from the rowdy men. He stood with his back to the wall, his arms crossed over his broad chest, looking down at her with those unsettling ice-blue eyes. While I am gone, you will continue your work on the records, he said quietly. Håkon has been instructed to ensure that you have everything you need and that no one disturbs you unnecessarily. If any man in this household treats you with disrespect or attempts to harm you in any way, you will report it to Håkon immediately. He has my full authority to punish such behavior as he sees fit. Thank you, Freya said, though the words felt strange on her tongue. Should she be thanking the man who had taken her freedom? Do not thank me, Thorfinn replied. I am protecting my investment, nothing more. You are valuable to me, and I do not allow my valuable possessions to be damaged or destroyed. Remember that, Freya. Your worth to me is the only thing keeping you safe. His words were harsh, but she sensed truth in them. He was not being kind out of compassion or decency. He was being practical, protecting something he viewed as his property. It was a cold comfort, but in this harsh world, she would take whatever comfort she could find. I understand, Jarl Thorfinn, she said quietly. He nodded once, apparently satisfied, and turned to rejoin his men. Freya returned to her small room, exhausted both physically and emotionally. As she lay down on the soft furs, she found herself thinking about Thorfinn Eriksson, trying to understand the man who now controlled her fate. He was brutal and cold, that much was clear, but he was also intelligent and pragmatic, willing to break with tradition if it served his purposes. He valued competence and honesty, and he protected what he saw as his. It was not much to build hope on, but it was something. If she could prove herself indispensable to him, if she could make herself too valuable to discard, then perhaps she could carve out a tolerable existence in this new life. It was a small hope, fragile as spring ice, but it was all she had. She clung to it as she drifted off into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of cold blue eyes and colder northern seas. The 3 days before Thorfinn's departure passed in a blur of activity. Freya threw herself into her work with single-minded determination, spending long hours in the record room organizing the chaotic mess of tablets and scrolls. She created categories for different types of records, livestock counts separate from trade agreements, debt records separate from raid spoils. She developed a system of notation that would allow anyone literate in runes to understand the organization at a glance, though she suspected she would be the only one maintaining these records for the foreseeable future. The work was demanding but satisfying in a way she had not expected. There was order in numbers, logic in the careful tallying of goods and resources. Here, in this small room surrounded by records and calculations, she could forget for hours at a time that she was a prisoner, that her freedom had been stripped away because of her brother's stupidity. Here, she had control over something, even if it was only the arrangement of wooden tablets on shelves. On the second day, she emerged from the record room to find Runa waiting for her with a concerned expression on her young face. The thrall girl could not have been more than 15 winters, small and thin with dark hair that hung in a simple braid down her back. She had been born into slavery, Freya had learned, the daughter of a thrall woman who had died in childbirth. She had known no other life than servitude. "Mistress Freya," Runa said softly, using the title that had been assigned to her despite Freya's protests. "You have been working since before dawn. You need to eat something and rest. You will make yourself ill if you continue like this." Freya looked at the girl with surprise. No one had shown concern for her well-being since she had arrived in Thorfinn's household, except in the practical sense of keeping his property functional. The genuine worry in Runa's voice touched something deep inside her, a reminder that kindness still existed in this harsh world. "Thank you, Runa," she said gently. "You are right. I have been pushing myself too hard. I suppose I am trying to prove that I am worth keeping around." Runa's expression grew even more troubled. "Everyone in the household can see that you work hard, mistress. The Jarl chose well when he took you. You should not doubt your value." The casual way Runa spoke of Freya being taken, as if it were normal and acceptable, made Freya's stomach turn. But she reminded herself that Runa had lived her entire life as property. To her, this was simply the way the world worked. There was no point in trying to explain to the girl why it felt so wrong, why every moment in this place felt like a betrayal of everything Freya had believed about herself and her life. She allowed Runa to bring her food and sat in the main hall to eat, watching as the household prepared for Thorfinn's departure. Men checked weapons and provisions, repaired sailcloth, and loaded trade goods onto carts to be transported to the ship. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation that reminded Freya these were not farmers or craftsmen, but warriors and raiders. Trading expeditions could turn into raids if the opportunities presented themselves, and these men lived for the chance to prove their courage and bring back wealth. Thorfinn himself was everywhere, overseeing every detail with the sharp eye of a man who knew that success or failure often hinged on small things. He moved through the chaos with absolute authority, his presence alone enough to make men work faster and more efficiently. Freya watched him from her seat at the table, studying him as she might study a dangerous animal, trying to understand what drove him, what made him the man he was. He was not like the other Jarls she had seen in her life. Most of them were content to sit in their halls, growing fat on the labor of others, sending younger men out to do the dangerous work of raiding and trading. But Thorfinn was different. He was always in the thick of things, leading from the front, taking the same risks he asked of his men. It was part of what made them so loyal to him, she realized. They knew he would never ask them to do something he was not willing to do himself. As if sensing her scrutiny, Thorfinn looked up from the shield he was examining, and his ice-blue eyes locked onto hers across the hall. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, and Freya felt that same strange sensation she had felt the first night, as if he were seeing through her skin to the thoughts beneath. Then he handed the shield to one of his men and walked toward her, with that predatory grace that made him seem more like a hunting cat than a man. "You should come with me to see the ship," he said when he reached her table. "It was not a request. You will need to understand what goes into a trading expedition if you are to keep proper records of our ventures." Freya set down her bread and stood, brushing crumbs from her dress. "As you wish, Jarl Thorfinn." They walked through the settlement together, Thorfinn's long strides forcing Freya to hurry to keep pace. People stopped what they were doing to watch them pass, and she could see the speculation in their eyes. What was the Jarl's new steward to him, really? Was she truly just a record keeper, or was there more to the arrangement? The gossip would be flying through Ravensfjord like ravens, she knew, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The ship was beached on the shore, a magnificent longship with a carved dragon head at the prow and shields mounted along its sides. It was perhaps 25 meters long, sleek and deadly-looking, built for speed and maneuverability. Men swarmed over it, making final preparations, checking the rigging and loading supplies into the hold. "She is called Stormdancer," Thorfinn said, a note of pride entering his voice for the first time since Freya had met him. "I had her built 5 years ago by the best shipwright in Norway. She is fast enough to outrun most pursuers and strong enough to survive the worst storms the sea can throw at her. With her, I have raided as far south as Francia, and as far west as the Irish coast. Freya looked at the ship, trying to see it as he did, as a thing of beauty and power rather than an instrument of violence and theft. She could appreciate the craftsmanship, the elegant lines and careful construction. But she could not forget that this ship had carried warriors to foreign shores, that blood had been spilled in its service, that families had been torn apart by the men who sailed in it. "She is impressive," she said, because some response seemed expected. Thorfinn glanced at her, and for a moment she thought she saw amusement in those cold eyes. "You do not approve of raiding." It was a statement, not a question, and Freya saw no point in lying. "I am the daughter of a farmer, Jarl Thorfinn. I know only the land and the animals, the cycle of seasons and the hard work of survival. The sea and its ways are foreign to me, and yes, the violence of raiding troubles me. But I also understand that this is how you and your men survive, how you gain the wealth that allows settlements like Ravensfjord to exist. I am not foolish enough to judge what I do not fully understand." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You are more thoughtful than I expected. Most people see only what they want to see, understand only what they want to understand. You at least try to see the whole picture, even when it makes you uncomfortable." "My mother taught me that wisdom comes from understanding different perspectives," Freya replied, "even when those perspectives conflict with your own beliefs. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman. It is a pity your father did not inherit her wisdom." He turned back to the ship, his expression hardening. "I will be gone for at least 2 weeks, possibly 3. In that time, I expect you to have the records in perfect order. Hakon will provide you with anything you need. If there are any problems, any threats or difficulties, you will report them to him immediately. He is a good man, honorable and loyal. You can trust him." "And what if the problem is Hakon himself?" Freya asked before she could stop herself. Thorfinn's head snapped around, his eyes narrowing. "Hakon would never harm you. He has served my family for 30 years, since before I was born. He is as close to a father as I have ever had. If I did not trust him completely, he would not be my Herser." "I meant no disrespect," Freya said quickly. "I am simply trying to understand the structure of power in your household, who I can rely on, and who I should be wary of." "Be wary of everyone," Thorfinn replied bluntly. "Trust no one completely, not even Hakon. People will use kindness to manipulate you, just as they will use cruelty to control you. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. Remember that, and you will survive." His words were harsh, but Freya sensed truth in them. This was clearly a lesson he had learned through painful experience, a worldview shaped by betrayal and violence. She wondered what had happened to make him so cynical, so unwilling to trust even those closest to him. But she did not ask. She had already learned that Thorfinn Eriksson did not appreciate questions about his personal history or his motivations. They returned to the longhouse in silence, and Thorfinn immediately threw himself back into the preparations. Freya retreated to her record room, but found it difficult to concentrate on her work. Her mind kept returning to their conversation by the ship, to the glimpses of the man beneath the fearsome reputation. He was more complex than she had realized, more intelligent and thoughtful. But he was also damaged in ways she was only beginning to understand, shaped by a world of violence and betrayal into something hard and cold. That night, the household gathered for a farewell feast. The tables were laden with food and ale, and the men were in high spirits, eager for the adventure ahead. Freya sat in her assigned place at the high table, picking at her food and watching the celebration around her. She noticed that while Thorfinn participated in the feast, drinking and talking with his men, there was a distance in him, a separateness that set him apart even in the midst of the crowd. He was their leader, their Jarl, but he was not truly one of them. He stood alone, even when surrounded by people. As the night wore on and the ale flowed freely, some of the younger warriors began to grow rowdy. One of them, a man named Thorstein, who had been watching Freya with increasing interest throughout the evening, stood and made his way unsteadily toward the high table. He was handsome in a rough way, with dark hair and a ready smile, but there was something predatory in his gaze that made Freya's skin crawl. "Mistress Freya," he said, his words slightly slurred, "you sit up there so quiet and serious, like a statue. Come down here and drink with us. Share a horn of ale with a warrior who appreciates beauty when he sees it." The hall grew quiet, men turning to watch this exchange with interest. Freya felt panic rise in her throat. She had no idea how to handle this situation. If she refused, would Thorstein be insulted? Would he cause trouble? But if she accepted, what would he expect from her? Before she could formulate a response, Thorfinn's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Thorstein, sit down. The young warrior turned to face his Jarl, swaying slightly. I meant no harm, Jarl Thorfinn. I was only being friendly to your new steward. I am sure you were, Thorfinn replied, his tone deceptively mild. But Freya is not here for your entertainment or friendship. She is here to work, and she has had a long day. I suggest you direct your friendliness toward someone more receptive to it. There was steel beneath the mild words, a clear warning that Thorstein would be wise to heed. The young warrior's face flushed with embarrassment and perhaps anger, but he was not drunk enough to challenge his Jarl directly. He muttered an apology and stumbled back to his seat, where his companions clapped him on the back and offered him more ale to soothe his wounded pride. Thorfinn caught Freya's eye and gave her a slight nod, a gesture that might have been reassurance or simply acknowledgement. She nodded back, grateful for his intervention, even as she hated being in a position where she needed his protection. This was her life now, she realized with sinking certainty. She would always be dependent on Thorfinn's goodwill, always vulnerable to the whims of the men around her. The only power she had was what he chose to give her, and he could take it away just as easily. The feast continued, but Freya's appetite had fled entirely. She sat at the high table, nursing a horn of ale, counting the minutes until she could escape to her room without causing offense. When she finally did retire, pleading exhaustion, she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about the future stretching out before her like an endless winter. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with mist rolling in from the sea. Freya rose early and went to the record room, determined to make as much progress as possible before Thorfinn departed. She worked steadily through the morning, pausing only when she heard the sounds of the crew assembling outside, preparing to march down to the ship. She set down her writing implement and went to the main hall, not certain why she felt compelled to see them off. Perhaps it was simply that she wanted to see Thorfinn leave, to have proof that she would have some breathing room for the next few weeks. Or perhaps some small part of her wanted to wish him safe journey, though that made no sense given that he was her captor. The crew was gathered in the courtyard, 30 strong men armed and ready for whatever the journey might bring. Håkon stood to one side, speaking quietly with several of the men who would remain behind to guard the settlement. And in the center of it all stood Thorfinn, tall and imposing in his leather armor, his long hair braided back, his sword at his hip. He looked every inch the legendary warrior his reputation claimed him to be, fierce and untamed as the sea itself. He saw her standing in the doorway of the longhouse and walked over, his men parting to let him through. "You came to see us off," he said, and there might have been surprise in his voice, though it was hard to tell. "I thought it proper," Freya replied. "You are my Jarl after all. It would be disrespectful not to acknowledge your departure." Thorfinn's ice-blue eyes searched her face, as if looking for some hidden meaning behind her words. "You do not need to pretend with me, Freya. I know you did not come here willingly, and I do not expect you to feel loyalty or affection toward me. Obedience and competence are enough." "Then you have both," Freya said quietly. "I will maintain your records and manage your household to the best of my ability. That is what you purchased with my family's debt, and that is what you will receive." Something flickered across Thorfinn's face, an expression too quick to identify before his features settled back into their usual hard mask. "Good. Then we understand each other." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Håkon will watch over you while I am gone, but you should know that not all men in this settlement are as honorable as he is. Thorstein's behavior last night was merely the first test. There will be others. Some men will see my absence as an opportunity to challenge the boundaries I have set around you. And what am I supposed to do if that happens?" Freya asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "I have no weapons, no training in combat. I am alone here, surrounded by warriors who could overpower me without effort." "You have something better than weapons," Thorfinn replied. "You have my name protecting you. Any man who harms you or shows you disrespect will answer to me when I return, and they know what that means. Most will not risk my anger for a moment's pleasure. Those few who are foolish enough to try, you will report to Håkon. He has my authority to deal with such matters as he sees fit, and he will not hesitate to use it." He reached into the leather pouch at his belt, and withdrew a small object, pressing it into her hand. It was a silver pendant on a leather cord, carved with intricate knotwork patterns and bearing his personal mark, the symbol that identified him and his household. Wear this where others can see it. It marks you as under my direct protection. No man in Ravensfjord will dare touch you while you wear it, and if we encounter others on our travels, the reputation of this mark will precede us. Freya looked down at the pendant, feeling its weight in her palm. It was beautifully made, the silver gleaming even in the gray morning light, the craftsmanship exquisite. But it was also a collar, another symbol of her captivity, a visible sign that she belonged to Thorfinn Eriksson. Wearing it would protect her, but it would also proclaim her status to everyone who saw it. Still, she was practical enough to recognize that protection was more valuable than pride. She slipped the cord over her head, letting the pendant rest against her chest where it would be clearly visible above the neckline of her dress. "Thank you, Jarl Thorfinn. I will wear it as you command." He nodded, satisfied, and then did something that surprised her. He reached out and adjusted the pendant slightly, his rough fingers brushing against her collarbone with unexpected gentleness. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent a strange shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. She looked up at him, startled, and found him watching her with an expression she could not read. "Keep yourself safe," he said, his voice lower, almost intimate. "I have invested too much in you to have you damaged while I am away." Then he turned and strode back to his men, calling out orders in his commanding voice, and the moment was broken. Freya stood in the doorway, her hand pressed against the pendant, trying to understand what had just happened. Had there been genuine concern in his voice, or was she simply reading emotions into his words that were not there? Was he truly worried about her safety, or only about the loss of his investment, as he claimed? She watched as the crew formed up and began their march toward the shore, Thorfinn at their head. He did not look back, but several of his men did, casting curious glances at the woman who had somehow become important enough to their Jarl that he would give her his personal mark. She could see the speculation in their eyes, the questions they did not dare voice aloud. Håkon remained behind, and once the crew had disappeared from view, he approached Freya with a grave expression. "The Jarl has placed great trust in you, girl. Do not make him regret it." "I have no intention of betraying his trust," Freya replied. "I understand my position here well enough. My life and my family's safety depend on my faithful service." The old Herseer studied her for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "You are afraid of him. That is wise. Thorfinn Eriksson is a dangerous man, perhaps the most dangerous I have ever known. But you should also know that he is not without honor. He keeps his word, always, even when it costs him dearly. If he has promised you protection and fair treatment in exchange for your service, then that is what you will receive." "And if I prove unsatisfactory?" Freya asked. "What happens then?" "Then you will be dismissed, returned to your family with your debt considered unpaid. Your father would have to find another way to satisfy the Jarl, or face the consequences of his son's theft. But I do not think that will happen. I watched you work yesterday, saw how you organized those records. You have the skills and the intelligence to be valuable to him. As long as you remain valuable, you will remain safe." It was cold comfort, but it was honest, and Freya appreciated honesty more than false reassurance. She nodded her understanding and returned to the record room, throwing herself back into her work with renewed determination. She would make herself indispensable. She would prove that Thorfinn's decision to take her as his steward was the right one. It was the only way to ensure her survival and her family's safety. The days passed slowly in Thorfinn's absence. Freya fell into a routine, rising before dawn to work on the records, breaking for meals with the household, then returning to her work until exhaustion forced her to rest. The system she had developed was taking shape, and she could see real progress. Where there had been chaos, there was now order. Where there had been confusion, there was now clarity. It was satisfying work, and it kept her mind occupied so she did not have time to dwell on her circumstances. Runa became a constant presence, bringing her meals and often staying to talk while Freya ate. The young thrall was starved for companionship, Freya realized, having never had anyone treat her as anything more than a servant. Freya listened to her stories about growing up in Thorfinn's household, about the other thralls and the household members, and through these conversations, she began to piece together a more complete picture of the man who owned her. Thorfinn had inherited the position of Jarl at 16 when his father was killed in a raid. He had been young and untested, and many had expected him to fail, to be overthrown by older, more experienced warriors. But instead, he had proven himself through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless violence. Those who challenged him found themselves defeated or dead, and those who supported him found themselves rewarded with wealth and honor. Within 2 years, he had consolidated his power completely, and no one dared question his authority. But there was a price for that power, Runa said with a sad expression. Thorfinn trusted no one, not truly. He had been betrayed too many times by people he thought were loyal, had seen too much treachery and ambition. He kept everyone at a distance, even Håkon, who had been like a father to him. He had never taken a wife, never shown interest in any of the women who threw themselves at him hoping to become the lady of his household. Some said he was incapable of love, that his heart had been frozen by the violence and betrayal that had marked his rise to power. Freya listened to these stories and felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of her was glad to know that Thorfinn seemed to have no interest in using her for physical pleasure, that his intentions toward her appeared to be purely practical. But another part of her, a part she did not want to acknowledge, felt something almost like pity for the man. To be so powerful and yet so alone, to trust no one, and allow no one close. It seemed like a terrible way to live. On the 5th day of Thorfinn's absence, trouble came as he had predicted it would. Freya was in the record room, deeply absorbed in reconciling a set of contradictory entries about grain stores, when she heard angry voices in the main hall. She set down her writing implement and moved to the doorway, peering out to see what was happening. Thorstein was there, along with 2 of his friends, arguing with Håkon. The young warrior's face was flushed with ale and anger, and his voice was loud enough to carry throughout the hall. "The Jarl is not here to coddle his pet anymore, old man. Why should she sit in comfort doing women's work while we labor in the fields and practice with weapons? She should be serving us, not pretending to be above us." The Jarl gave clear instructions regarding Freya's position and treatment. Håkon replied, his voice calm but firm. "She is his steward, and she will be treated with the respect that position deserves. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with Thorfinn when he returns." "Maybe I will," Thorstein shot back. "Maybe a lot of us will. We are tired of watching him give special treatment to some farmer's daughter just because she can scratch marks on tablets. What makes her so special? What does she do for him that earns her such favor?" The implication in his words was clear and ugly, and Freya felt her face burn with shame and anger. She stepped out of the record room, her hand going instinctively to the silver pendant at her throat. "I earn my place through my work, Thorstein, the same as any man here. If you doubt that, you are welcome to examine the records I have organized. Perhaps you can do better, if you can read." The last words were a calculated insult. She knew perfectly well that Thorstein could not read runes any more than he could read Latin. Few of the warriors could, relying instead on oral tradition and memory. By challenging his literacy, she was reminding him and everyone present of the skills that made her valuable to Thorfinn, skills that none of them possessed. Thorstein's face darkened with rage. "Careful, girl. The Jarl's protection only goes so far. Accidents happen, especially to those who forget their place. Is that a threat?" Håkon's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He moved between Thorstein and Freya, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Because if you are threatening a member of the Jarl's household, specifically one he has marked with his personal symbol, then you are threatening Thorfinn himself. I wonder if you are brave enough to follow through on such a threat, or if you are simply drunk and foolish." The hall had gone silent, every man present watching to see how this confrontation would play out. Thorstein looked around, perhaps expecting support from his friends, but they had both taken a step back, unwilling to be associated with what was rapidly becoming a challenge to the Jarl's authority. "I was not threatening anyone," Thorstein muttered, his bravado deflating under Håkon's steady gaze. "I was simply stating facts. But I will remember this, old man, and I will remember you too, Freya. When the Jarl tires of you, as he tires of all things eventually, there will be no one to protect you then." He turned and stalked out of the hall, his friends hurrying after him. The tension drained from the room slowly, like water seeping through sand. Håkon turned to Freya, his expression serious. "Go back to your work. I will handle this." Freya nodded and retreated to the record room, but her hands were shaking as she picked up her writing implement. The confrontation had frightened her more than she wanted to admit. Torstein was right about one thing. Thorfinn's protection would not last forever. Eventually, she would cease to be useful or interesting to him, and when that happened, what would become of her? She would be just another woman in a settlement full of warriors, with no family to protect her and no resources of her own. She forced herself to focus on her work, using the familiar rhythm of organizing and recording to calm her racing heart. But part of her mind was already thinking ahead, planning for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. She needed to make herself more than just useful to Thorfinn. She needed to make herself indispensable, irreplaceable. Only then would she have any hope of long-term security. The days continued to pass, and gradually the household settled back into its routine. Torstein and his friends avoided Freya, shooting her dark looks but making no more direct challenges. Hakon remained vigilant, his presence a constant reminder that the Jarl's authority extended even in his absence. And Freya worked, pouring all her energy and intelligence into creating a system of record-keeping that would impress even the most critical observer. On the 10th day, a merchant ship arrived at Ravnsfjord, bringing news and trade goods from the south. Hakon invited the merchant captain to dine in the hall, and Freya found herself called upon to record the details of the trade agreement they negotiated. It was her first real test, conducting business on behalf of the Jarl in his absence, and she was nervous about making a mistake. But as she sat at the table with her tablets and stylus, listening to Hakon and the merchant discuss prices and quantities, she found that the skills Brother Cuthbert had taught her served her well. She recorded everything accurately, asked clarifying questions when necessary, and even pointed out a discrepancy in the merchant's accounting that would have cost Thorfinn's household several silver coins. The merchant looked at her with surprise and grudging respect. "Your steward has a sharp mind, Hakon. The Jarl is fortunate to have found someone with such skills." "The Jarl has always had a talent for recognizing value where others see none," Hakon replied, and there was approval in his voice as he looked at Freya. "She has proven herself worthy of the trust he placed in her." After the merchant left, Hakon called Freya aside. "You did well today. Very well. The Jarl will be pleased when I tell him how you handled the negotiation. You are becoming exactly what he needs, Freya. A steward he can trust to manage his affairs when he is away. That is no small thing." Freya felt a flush of pride at the praise, followed immediately by confusion about why she should care about earning Thorfinn's approval. He was her captor, the man who had taken her freedom. She should hate him, should resent every moment spent in his service. But instead, she found herself wanting to prove her worth, wanting to show him that his faith in her abilities was justified. It was a troubling realization, one she did not want to examine too closely. That night, as she lay in her bed, she found her thoughts turning to Thorfinn against her will. She wondered where he was, whether his trading expedition had been successful, whether he was safe. The last thought surprised her most of all. Why should she care about his safety? If he died on this journey, she would be freed from his service, returned to her family. It should be a hope, not a fear. But the truth was more complicated than that. In the 2 weeks she had spent in his household, she had come to understand that Thorfinn, for all his coldness and cruelty, was at least predictable and honorable in his own way. He had kept his word to her, had protected her as promised, had treated her with a rough sort of respect. If he died and another man took control of his holdings, there was no guarantee that new Jarl would honor Thorfinn's agreements or protect his former steward. She might find herself in a far worse position than she was now. The storm dancer returned to Ravnsfjord on a gray afternoon 17 days after its departure, its dragon prow cutting through the choppy waters of the fjord with graceful precision. Word of the ship's arrival spread quickly through the settlement, and people gathered on the shore to watch as the crew brought their vessel to beach. Freya heard the commotion from the record room, where she had been tallying the autumn harvest yields, and felt her heart skip inexplicably at the news of Thorfinn's return. She set down her stylus with hands that trembled slightly, annoyed at herself for the nervous flutter in her stomach. She had been dreading this moment and anticipating it in equal measure for days. The records were complete, organized beyond anything that had existed before, and she was confident in her work. But would Thorfinn be satisfied? Would he find her efforts worthy of the protection and position he had given her? And why did his approval suddenly matter so much to her? She forced herself to remain in the record room, refusing to join the crowd rushing to the shore like an eager child. She was his steward, not some lovesick girl waiting for her warrior to return from battle. She would present her work professionally when summoned, nothing more. But despite her resolution, she found herself straining to hear the sounds from outside, the voices of men greeting their jarl, the excited chatter of the household. Nearly an hour passed before Sten appeared in the doorway of the record room. "The jarl requests your presence in the hall. He wishes to review the records and hear your report on the household's affairs during his absence." Freya gathered the summary tablets she had prepared specifically for this purpose, taking a moment to steady her breathing before following Sten to the main hall. The space was crowded with warriors, their voices loud with the excitement of successful trading and the relief of coming home. The smell of salt and sea spray clung to them, mixed with sweat and the tang of foreign spices from the goods they had acquired. Thorfinn stood near the hearth, still wearing his travel-stained leather armor, speaking with Håkon in low tones. Even exhausted from the journey, he commanded the room with his presence, every line of his body radiating controlled power. His ice-blue eyes lifted as Freya entered, tracking her movement across the hall with an intensity that made her acutely aware of every step she took. She stopped before him at a respectful distance and inclined her head. "Welcome home, Jarl Thorfinn. I trust your journey was successful." "Successful enough," he replied, his deep voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "We traded well in the south and acquired goods that will see us comfortably through the winter. But I am more interested in hearing about how things went here in my absence. Håkon has given me his report, but I want to hear yours as well." Freya held up the tablets she had brought. "I have prepared a complete summary of all household activities during your absence. The records are now fully organized and current. All debts have been recorded, all livestock tallied, all provisions accounted for. I have also established a system that will allow for easy updating and reference going forward." She proceeded to walk him through her organizational system, explaining the logic behind her categories and the notation she had developed. Thorfinn listened with focused attention, asking sharp questions that demonstrated he understood exactly what she had accomplished. As she spoke, she became aware that the noise in the hall had gradually diminished, warriors pausing their conversations to watch their jarl and his steward discuss matters that most of them found incomprehensibly boring but recognized as important. When she finished her presentation, Thorfinn took the tablets from her and examined them closely, his scarred fingers tracing the runes she had carved with such care. The silence stretched out as he reviewed her work, and Freya felt sweat prickling at the back of her neck despite the cool air. Everything depended on this moment, on whether he found her efforts satisfactory. Finally, he looked up at her, and something in his expression had shifted. The coldness was still there, but beneath it she detected something that might have been respect, perhaps even approval. "This is exceptional work, Freya. Better than I expected. Better than old Kolbein ever achieved, if I am being honest. You have not only restored order to chaos, you have improved upon what existed before. You have proven your worth beyond any doubt." Relief flooded through Freya so intensely that she felt momentarily dizzy. "Thank you, Jarl Thorfinn. I am pleased that my work meets your standards. It exceeds them," he corrected. He turned to address the hall, raising his voice so all could hear. "Let it be known that Freya has proven herself a valuable member of this household. She is under my direct protection, and any man who shows her disrespect or causes her harm will answer to me personally. This is not a suggestion or a request. It is law within my domain." His gaze swept across the assembled warriors, lingering briefly on Thorstein, who stood near the back of the hall with a sullen expression. The message was clear, and no one dared to challenge it. Thorfinn Eriksson had spoken, and his word was absolute. The feast that night was more elaborate than usual, celebrating both the successful trading expedition and, it seemed, Freya's successful management of household affairs. She sat at her usual place at the high table, but this time Thorfinn engaged her in conversation throughout the meal, asking her questions about specific aspects of the records and discussing plans for the coming winter. It was strange and unsettling to be the focus of his attention, to have him speak to her as if her opinions mattered, as if she were more than just property. As the evening wore on and the ale flowed more freely, Thorfinn leaned closer to her, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Håkon told me about Thorstein's behavior while I was gone. He said you handled yourself well, did not cower or beg for protection, but stood your ground and used your wit as a weapon." "I did what was necessary to maintain my position," Freya replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite his proximity. This close, she could smell the sea salt in his hair, the leather of his tunic, something else that was distinctly him. Showing weakness would have invited more challenges. You understand power, then. That is good. Power in this world belongs to those who are willing to take it and strong enough to hold it. Physical strength is one kind of power, but intelligence and skill are another. You have proven you possess both. He paused, studying her face with those unsettling ice-blue eyes. You are angry with me still. I can see it, beneath the careful courtesy. You hate that I took you from your family, that I own you like I own my ship or my sword. That is natural, and I do not fault you for it. But I want you to understand something, Freya. The world is cruel and arbitrary, especially for women. You could have been born to a wealthy family, lived a life of comfort and security, but you were not. You were born to a poor farmer with a foolish son, and your beauty and intelligence would have been wasted, married off to some brute who would use you for breeding and labor until you died young and worn out. His words stung because there was truth in them, a truth Freya had never wanted to acknowledge. And being owned by you is somehow better? She asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Yes, Thorfinn said bluntly, because I recognize your value beyond your body. Because I give you work that challenges your mind and allows you to develop skills that will serve you all your life. Because under my protection, you are safer than you would be anywhere else in this harsh world. I am not asking you to be grateful, Freya. I am simply asking you to recognize reality for what it is. Freya wanted to argue, to reject his cold logic, but she could not. Everything he said was true, as much as she hated to admit it. She had seen the lives of other women in Ravensfjord, seen how they were worn down by endless childbearing and backbreaking labor, how they aged before their time and died young more often than not. Her position as Thorfinn's steward was indeed better than most alternatives available to a woman of her station. I understand, she said quietly, and I will continue to serve you faithfully, as I have promised. But do not expect me to pretend that I chose this life willingly. Something flickered across Thorfinn's face, an expression too complex to name. I would not want you to. Pretense is for the weak and the dishonest. You are neither. He reached out suddenly and touched the silver pendant at her throat, his fingers brushing against her skin just as they had when he gave it to her. You wore this every day while I was gone. Håkon told me. You could have hidden it, could have removed it when no one was watching. But you kept it visible, kept yourself marked as mine. Why? The question caught Freya off guard. She had not thought about it consciously, had simply worn the pendant because it offered protection. But now, with Thorfinn's eyes boring into hers and his hand still resting against her throat, she was forced to confront a more complicated truth. The pendant had become more than just a symbol of protection. It had become a connection to him, a tangible reminder of the strange relationship that was developing between them, despite her best efforts to remain emotionally distant. Because it kept me safe, she said. But even to her own ears the words sounded incomplete. Only because of what it represents, Thorfinn replied. My mark, my protection, my claim on you. You could have resented it, hidden it, wished it gone. But instead you wore it openly. I find that interesting. He withdrew his hand and turned his attention back to his meal, leaving Freya flustered and confused. What was he implying? What did he want from her? She had thought she understood the nature of their arrangement, a simple transaction of service for protection. But increasingly she sensed layers of complexity beneath the surface, currents she could not quite navigate. The feast continued late into the night, but Freya excused herself as soon as it was socially acceptable to do so. She needed to be alone, to think, to process the conflicting emotions that Thorfinn stirred in her. In the safety of her small room, she removed the pendant and held it in her palm, studying the intricate knotwork by lamplight. It was beautiful in its own way, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, but it was also a chain, binding her to a man she barely understood, a man who terrified and intrigued her in equal measure. She hung the pendant back around her neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against her chest. Tomorrow she would resume her duties, would throw herself back into the work that gave her purpose and kept her mind occupied. But tonight, alone in the darkness, she allowed herself to acknowledge a troubling truth. She was becoming accustomed to her life in Thorfinn's household. The work satisfied her in ways she had never expected, and the man himself, despite his coldness and cruelty, possessed qualities she could not help but respect. It was a dangerous realization, one that threatened the careful, emotional distance she had been trying to maintain. The next morning, Freya woke to find Runa waiting for her with an excited expression. "The Jarl has called for you, mistress. He is in the record room and wishes to discuss something important." Freya dressed quickly and made her way to the record room, wondering what could be so urgent. She found Thorfinn examining the shelves of organized tablets, running his fingers along the neat rows with what might have been satisfaction. He had bathed and changed since last night, his long hair still damp and hanging loose around his shoulders, and he looked less worn than he had upon his return. "You wanted to see me, Jarl Thorfinn?" Freya said from the doorway. He turned to face her, and there was something different in his expression this morning, a purposefulness that made her wary. "I have been thinking about your position in this household, Freya, about what you have accomplished and what you might accomplish in the future. You have proven yourself far more capable than I initially expected, and I find myself wanting to expand your responsibilities." "In what way?" Freya asked cautiously. "I want you to learn about trading, about negotiation and commerce. Hakon is skilled in matters of war and leadership, but he is less comfortable with the intricacies of trade agreements and merchant dealings. That was always Kolbein's domain, and it has been a weakness since his death. I want you to fill that role, to accompany me on future trading expeditions and handle negotiations on my behalf." Freya stared at him, stunned. "You want to take me with you? On your ship? To foreign lands? Why not? You have the intelligence and the skills. You speak our language and the Saxon tongue, thanks to that Christian monk who taught you. That alone makes you valuable in trade negotiations. And I have seen how you handle yourself under pressure. You do not panic or lose your composure. Those are rare qualities, Freya, especially in someone so young." "But I am a woman," Freya protested. "Foreign merchants will not take me seriously. They will see me as a curiosity at best, an insult at worst." "Let them," Thorfinn replied with a slight smile. "Their underestimation of you will be my advantage. They will negotiate less carefully, reveal more than they intend, because they will not see you as a threat. By the time they realize their mistake, the deal will be done and weighted in our favor." It was a clever strategy, Freya had to admit, and the prospect of seeing foreign lands, of experiencing more of the world than just Ravensfjord, stirred something in her she had not felt in weeks. Excitement, anticipation, hope for something beyond the narrow confines of her captivity. But she was also afraid. Leaving Ravensfjord meant leaving behind whatever fragile security she had established here. It meant being completely dependent on Thorfinn in strange lands among strange people. It meant trusting him with not just her position, but her very life. "I sense your hesitation," Thorfinn said, his voice gentler than usual. "But understand this, Freya. I would not take you with me if I did not believe you could handle it, and I would not risk losing you to foreign dangers. You have become too valuable to me in ways that go beyond your skills with records and numbers." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither seemed willing to examine too closely. Freya felt her breath catch in her throat as she searched Thorfinn's face for some clue to what he meant. His ice-blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and for a moment the record room seemed to shrink, the space between them charged with something she did not have a name for. "I will do as you command, Jarl Thorfinn," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you believe I can be useful to you in trade negotiations, then I will learn whatever I need to learn." "Good." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body despite the cool morning air. "We will not leave until spring. The seas are too dangerous for trading expeditions during winter, and there is much you need to learn before then. I will teach you myself about trade routes and merchant customs, about how to read men's intentions and negotiate favorable terms. You are intelligent enough to master these skills quickly, I think." The thought of spending the long winter months working closely with Thorfinn, learning from him, being near him day after day, filled Freya with a confusing mixture of apprehension and something dangerously close to anticipation. She had been trying so hard to maintain emotional distance from him, to see him only as her captor and nothing more. But that distance was eroding with every conversation, every moment they spent together. "When do we begin?" she asked. "Today, if you are willing. I have trade goods from our recent expedition that need to be cataloged and valued. You can help me with that work, and I will explain the considerations that went into each purchase, the negotiations that took place, the cultural factors that influenced the outcomes. It will be your first lesson." They spent the rest of the morning in the storage building where Thorfinn kept his trade goods, surrounded by bolts of cloth from Francia, amber from the Baltic, furs from the far north, and spices from lands so distant Freya had never heard their names. Thorfinn moved among these treasures with practiced ease, explaining the value of each item, the markets where they could be sold for maximum profit, the merchants who were trustworthy and those who would cheat given the opportunity. Freya listened intently, asking questions when something was unclear, making mental notes about everything he said. She discovered that she had a natural aptitude for this kind of work, that the logic of trade and negotiation appealed to the same part of her mind that enjoyed organizing records and solving mathematical problems. And more than that, she found herself genuinely interested in Thorfinn's stories about foreign lands and different peoples, about the wider world that existed beyond the narrow boundaries of Ravensfjord. As they worked, she became increasingly aware of him in ways that troubled her. The way his hands moved with surprising delicacy as he examined a piece of silk, the deep rumble of his voice when he laughed at some memory of a particularly difficult negotiation, the rare moments when his harsh features softened into something almost approachable. He was still the same man who had taken her freedom, still cold and dangerous, but she was beginning to see the complexity beneath the surface, the intelligence and even humor that he kept carefully hidden from most people. "You are staring at me," Thorfinn said suddenly, not looking up from the amber pieces he was sorting. "Is there something on my face, or are you simply lost in thought?" Freya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment at being caught. "I was thinking about how different you are when you speak of trade than when you address your warriors. Your whole demeanor changes. You almost seem like a different person." He glanced at her then, one eyebrow raised. "And which version do you prefer?" It was a dangerous question, loaded with implications she did not want to consider. "I prefer honesty in all its forms," she said carefully. "Whether that honesty comes wrapped in courtesy or delivered with brutal directness does not matter, as long as it is truth." A diplomatic answer. Thorfinn set down the amber and turned to face her fully. "But I asked what you prefer, not what you think is most virtuous. Do you prefer the Jarl who commands his warriors with cold authority, or the man who speaks with passion about trade routes and foreign customs?" Freya met his gaze, refusing to look away despite the intensity of his stare. "I prefer the man who treats me as if I have a mind worth engaging, regardless of which role he is playing at the moment. That man is rare enough in my experience to be valued, whatever his other qualities might be." Something shifted in Thorfinn's expression, a crack appearing in his usual cold mask. For a moment, she thought she saw a vulnerability there, a flash of something almost like loneliness before he locked it away again. "You see too much, Freya. That could be dangerous for both of us. Because I might use what I see against you?" she asked. "Or because acknowledging what I see forces you to acknowledge it as well? Both, perhaps." He turned back to his work, but his movements were less fluid now, as if her words had disturbed some carefully maintained balance. "We should finish cataloging these goods. There is still much to do before midday meal." They worked in silence for a while, but the atmosphere had changed, become charged with unspoken things that pressed against the boundaries of their carefully defined relationship. Freya found her thoughts drifting to questions she knew she should not ask, observations she should not make. Why had Thorfinn never taken a wife? Why did he keep everyone at such distance? What had happened to make him so certain that trust was foolishness and vulnerability was weakness? As if sensing the direction of her thoughts, Thorfinn spoke without looking at her. "You want to ask me something. I can feel the questions building up in you like storm clouds on the horizon. Ask if you must. I may not answer, but I will not punish you for curiosity." Freya hesitated, weighing the wisdom of pursuing this line of inquiry. But in the end, her need to understand him won out over caution. "Why do you live like this? Surrounded by people yet alone? Powerful yet trusting no one? What happened to make you this way?" Thorfinn was silent for so long that Freya thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was distant, as if he were speaking of events that had happened to someone else. "When I was 15 winters old, I loved a girl. Her name was Sigrid, and she was beautiful and kind, the daughter of one of my father's closest allies. We planned to marry when I reached 16 winters, to unite our families and strengthen my father's position. I believed she loved me as I loved her, believed in the future we had planned together." He paused, his jaw tight with old anger. "But she did not love me. She loved my father's Herseer, a man twice her age who whispered promises in her ear about the wealth and power he would have once my father died. Together they plotted to murder my father and place the Herseer in his position as Jarl. They would have succeeded too if I had not overheard them discussing their plans one night when they thought everyone was asleep. Freya felt her stomach twist with horror and pity. What did you do? I told my father what I had heard. He confronted them, and they denied it, claimed I was lying out of jealousy or madness. My father wanted to believe them, wanted to trust his Herseer and his ally's daughter. But I insisted, and finally he agreed to test their loyalty. He announced that he was leaving on a raid and would be gone for a week, leaving the Herseer in charge of the settlement. Then he hid and watched to see what would happen. Thorfinn's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. That very night, they attempted to murder him in his supposed absence. The Herseer came to his chambers with a knife, and Sigrid was with him, ready to watch the man I loved be killed by the man she loved. My father killed the Herseer in the fight that followed, but Sigrid managed to escape. She fled to her father's lands, and her father refused to hand her over for judgment. It nearly sparked a war between our settlements. What happened to her? Freya asked quietly. She married another man, bore his children, lived a comfortable life as far as I know. My father decided that war would cost more than it was worth, so he let the matter drop. But he was never the same after that betrayal. He trusted no one, grew increasingly paranoid and isolated. He died less than a year later in a raid that he should have survived, killed because he hesitated to accept help from his own men, certain they would betray him if given the chance. The pain in Thorfinn's voice was raw despite the years that had passed. Freya understood now, understood the source of his coldness and his refusal to trust. He had learned young and harshly that even those who seemed to love you could betray you, that vulnerability was a weapon others would use against you. I am sorry that happened to you, she said softly. No one should have to learn such lessons so young. It was necessary, Thorfinn replied, his voice hardening again as he reasserted control over his emotions. It made me who I am, taught me to rely only on myself. I have survived where softer men would have fallen, prospered where trusting fools would have been destroyed. I do not regret the lessons I learned, only the price that was paid for them. But you are lonely, Freya said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Power and wealth are cold comforts when you have no one to share them with, no one who knows you as you truly are. Thorfinn's head snapped toward her, his ice blue eyes blazing with something that might have been anger or might have been anguish. And what would you know of loneliness, farmer's daughter? You who have family and community, who know what it is to be loved and valued simply for existing. I know what it is to be alone even when surrounded by people, Freya replied, her own voice rising to match his intensity. I know what it is to have no one understand the thoughts in your head or the dreams in your heart. I know what it is to be valued only for what you can provide, not for who you are. Perhaps our loneliness comes from different sources, Jarl Thorfinn, but do not presume that yours is the only kind that matters. The silence that followed was electric, crackling with emotion too raw to name. They stood facing each other among the trade goods, both breathing hard, both exposed in ways neither had intended. Freya realized with a shock that her eyes were stinging with unshed tears, and she blinked them back furiously, refusing to show such weakness. Thorfinn moved then, closing the distance between them with 2 long strides. For a moment Freya thought he meant to hurt her, to punish her for her presumption and her words, but instead he reached out and cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a man. You see too much, he repeated, his voice rough with emotion, and you speak truths that others would not dare voice. It is dangerous, Freya, dangerous for you and dangerous for me. But I find that I cannot make myself care about the danger when you look at me like that, as if you see the man beneath the reputation. Freya's heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could feel it through her skin. What do you want from me, Thorfinn? I do not understand what is happening between us, what this is becoming. Neither do I, he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was more frightening than any threat could have been. I took you to be my steward, nothing more. A tool to be used, a possession to be valued for its utility. But you have become something else, something I did not expect and do not know how to handle. You challenge me, question me, see through the armor I have spent years building, and instead of resenting it as I should, I find myself wanting more of it, wanting more of you." His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Freya felt something deep inside her shift and crack, like ice breaking up in spring. She should pull away, should remind him and herself that she was here against her will, that whatever was growing between them was built on a foundation of coercion and captivity. But the words would not come, lost somewhere in the confusion of her own feelings. "I am still your prisoner," she whispered. "Nothing you say or do changes that fundamental truth. I am here because you took me, because my family had no choice. How can anything real grow from such beginnings?" "I do not know," Thorfinn replied, "but I am beginning to think that the way something starts matters less than what we choose to make of it. Yes, I took you. Yes, you are here because of circumstances beyond your control. But what happens next, Freya, that is something we can choose together." Before she could respond, before she could even begin to process what he was suggesting, the door to the storage building burst open and Håkon rushed in, his weathered face urgent with concern. Jarl Thorfinn, riders approaching from the east. At least 20 men, armed and moving fast. They fly the banner of Jarl Sven Bloodaxe. Thorfinn's entire demeanor changed instantly, the vulnerable man disappearing and the hard warrior taking his place. He dropped his hands from Freya's face and turned to Håkon with cold focus. "Sven has no business in my lands. His territory is 2 days' ride from here. Ready the men for battle, but do not engage unless I give the order. I will greet these visitors and discover what brings them to Ravensfjord uninvited." He strode from the building without another glance at Freya, leaving her standing among the trade goods with her mind reeling and her heart in turmoil. The moment they had shared, the things he had said and almost done, all of it had been swept away in an instant by the demands of his position and the threat of violence. It was a stark reminder of the world they lived in, a world where tenderness was a luxury that could be afforded only in rare, stolen moments between crises. Freya followed Håkon and Thorfinn back to the main hall, where warriors were arming themselves with grim efficiency. The atmosphere had shifted completely, the easy camaraderie of the morning replaced by tense readiness. These men were prepared to fight and die if their Jarl commanded it, and they would do so without hesitation or complaint. It was both admirable and terrifying to witness. Thorfinn stood at the entrance of his hall, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching as the column of riders approached through the settlement. Freya positioned herself slightly behind him, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid interfering with whatever was about to unfold. Her hand went instinctively to the silver pendant at her throat, drawing strength from its familiar weight. The riders came to a halt before the hall, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold air. At their head rode a man who could only be Jarl Sven Bloodaxe, a name Freya had heard whispered with fear and respect throughout Ravensfjord. He was older than Thorfinn by perhaps 10 winters, with graying red hair and a beard braided with silver wire. His arms were covered in intricate tattoos, and a massive axe hung from his saddle, its blade notched and stained from countless battles. "Thorfinn Eriksson," Sven called out, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard. "It has been too long since we last met. I hope you will forgive this unannounced visit, but the matter that brings me here could not wait for proper diplomatic channels." Thorfinn's expression remained carefully neutral, but Freya could sense the tension coiling in his massive frame. "Jarl Sven, you and your men are welcome to the hospitality of my hall, though I confess curiosity about what matter could be so urgent that it brings you 2 days from your own lands." Sven dismounted with the easy grace of a lifelong warrior, and approached Thorfinn with a broad smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Let us speak inside, away from eager ears. What I have to discuss concerns both our futures and requires privacy." Thorfinn gestured toward the hall, and the 2 jarls entered together, followed by Håkon and 3 of Sven's most trusted men. Freya hesitated at the threshold, uncertain whether she should follow, when Thorfinn glanced back at her. "Freya, attend us. You will want to hear this, I think." Inside the hall, servants hurried to bring mead and food while the men settled around the high table. Freya took her usual seat, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, while remaining alert to every word and gesture. Whatever had brought Sven Bloodaxe to Ravensfjord, it was not a social call. Once the formalities of hospitality had been observed and cups of mead distributed, Sven leaned back in his chair and fixed Thorfinn with a calculating stare. "I will speak plainly, as is my way. Word has reached me that you have become quite successful in your trading ventures, that your wealth has grown considerably this past year. This is good for you, of course, but it creates a problem for those of us who share borders with your territory. How so? Thorfinn's voice was deceptively mild, but Freya could see his knuckles whiten as his hand tightened around his drinking horn. Your success attracts attention, Thorfinn. Merchants who once came to my ports now sail to yours. Warriors who might have sought service in my hall now seek yours instead. Your growing power creates an imbalance in the region, one that cannot be allowed to continue unchecked. Sven paused to drink deeply from his horn before continuing. I have come to propose an alliance, one that would benefit us both and restore equilibrium to our relationship. What kind of alliance? Thorfinn asked, though Freya suspected he already knew where this conversation was heading. A marriage alliance, Sven replied, confirming her suspicion. I have a daughter, Astrid, 18 winters old and beautiful as the morning sun. She is intelligent, well-trained in household management, and would make you a worthy wife. Unite our families through marriage, and we become allies instead of potential rivals. Your wealth combined with my military strength would make us the most powerful force in this region. No one would dare challenge us. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, sending ripples of implication through everyone present. Freya felt something cold and sharp twist in her chest, a feeling she refused to name or acknowledge. This was exactly what she should want, she told herself. If Thorfinn took a wife, his attention would be diverted away from her. She would simply be his steward, nothing more, and the confusing tangle of emotions that had been growing between them would wither and die. She would be safe from whatever dangerous thing had been building between them in the storage house that morning. But the thought of Thorfinn with another woman, of him looking at someone else the way he had looked at her, of him touching someone else with that unexpected gentleness, filled her with something that felt disturbingly like jealousy. Thorfinn set down his drinking horn with deliberate care, his ice-blue eyes never leaving Sven's face. Your proposal is generous, Jarl Sven, and the strategic advantages are clear. But I must ask, why come to me with this offer now? You have had a marriageable daughter for several years, yet you have never approached me before. What has changed? Sven's smile widened, showing teeth. You have changed, Thorfinn. You have grown from a promising young jarl into a true power in this land. 3 years ago you were interesting but unproven. Now you are a force that cannot be ignored. I prefer to have such forces as allies rather than enemies. And if I refuse your generous offer? The smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in Sven's eyes. Then I would be disappointed, of course. And disappointment sometimes leads to unfortunate misunderstandings between neighbors. Borders become disputed. Trade routes become contested. Warriors on both sides grow restless and seek glory in raiding each other's lands. It would be a waste, Thorfinn, a tragic waste of resources and lives, but such things happen when alliances are not properly maintained. It was a threat, barely veiled but unmistakable. Accept the marriage or face conflict that could escalate into open war. Freya watched Thorfinn's face, trying to read his thoughts, but his expression had gone completely cold and unreadable. This was the Jarl who commanded armies and negotiated with foreign powers, not the man who had touched her face with such unexpected tenderness just an hour before. I will need time to consider your proposal, Thorfinn said finally. A marriage alliance is not something to be entered into lightly. Give me 3 days to think on this matter and consult with my advisors. You and your men are welcome to enjoy my hospitality during that time. Sven raised his horn in salute. 3 days is fair. I look forward to your answer, Thorfinn Eriksson. I truly hope it will be the one that benefits us both. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced hospitality and careful diplomacy. Sven's men were quartered in the settlement, and a feast was prepared to honor the visiting Jarl. Freya performed her duties mechanically, ensuring that everything ran smoothly, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the implications of what had transpired. That night, after the feast had wound down and most of the men had retired to drink and tell stories, Freya found herself alone in the record room, staring at tablets without really seeing them. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Thorfinn standing in the doorway, looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. You should be resting, she said quietly. Tomorrow will be another difficult day of diplomacy and veiled threats. I cannot rest, Thorfinn replied, entering the room and closing the door behind him. My mind will not quiet itself long enough to allow sleep. I keep thinking about Sven's proposal, about all the angles and implications. It is a logical match. Freya said, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. An alliance with Sven would strengthen your position significantly. His daughter is probably well-trained and suitable for the role of your wife. You should accept the proposal. Thorfinn moved closer, his eyes searching her face. Should I? And why are you so eager to see me married off to a woman I have never met? Because it is practical, Freya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Because it is what Jarls do to secure their power and their futures. Because it would be foolish to refuse such an advantageous offer simply because... She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Simply because of what? Thorfinn pressed, now standing directly in front of her. Say it, Freya. Give voice to the thing we have both been avoiding since this morning. Because of whatever this is between us, Freya said, the words rushing out before she could stop them. This impossible, inappropriate thing that should not exist but does anyway. You should marry Sven's daughter and forget about me. Forget about the moment in the storage house. Forget about everything except your duty to your people and your position. And what if I do not want to forget? Thorfinn asked, his voice low and intense. What if I am tired of doing only what is practical and logical? What if I want something for myself? Something that has nothing to do with power or alliances or strategic advantage. Freya's heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts over its thunder. You cannot afford to want such things. You are a Jarl, and Jarls do not have the luxury of choosing their wives based on personal feelings. You know this better than anyone. I know what I have always believed, Thorfinn replied. I know the lessons I learned from betrayal and loss. But you have made me question those lessons, Freya. You have made me wonder if perhaps I have been wrong about some things. If perhaps closing myself off from all possibility of connection was not wisdom but cowardice. He reached out and took her hands in his calloused palms warm against her skin. When Sven made his proposal today, do you know what my first thought was? It was not about strategy or alliances or political advantage. It was about you, about how I would feel watching another woman take the place that I find myself wanting to give to you. Freya felt tears prick at her eyes, a combination of hope and despair warring within her. You took me as payment for a debt, Thorfinn. You own me. How can anything real or true grow from such a beginning? Even if you feel something for me now, how could I ever trust that it is genuine and not simply the attachment of a man to his favorite possession? By giving me the chance to prove it, Thorfinn said urgently, by allowing me to change the terms of our arrangement, to offer you something I have never offered anyone else. Freedom, Freya. I will free you from your debt, release you from your obligation to serve me. You can return to your family if you wish, or go anywhere else in the world that you desire. I will give you enough silver to start a new life, to be independent and beholden to no one. Freya stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. Why would you do that? Why would you give up leverage over me? Because I want you to choose to stay, Thorfinn said simply. Not because you have no choice, not because you are bound by debt or fear, but because you want to be here, because you feel for me what I have come to feel for you. And if you do not, if you choose to leave, then at least I will know the truth rather than living with the uncertainty of wondering if anything between us was real. The offer hung in the air between them, more significant than any marriage proposal or political alliance could ever be. Thorfinn was offering her the thing she had wanted most since the night he took her from her family. Freedom, the chance to reclaim her life and make her own choices. It should have been an easy decision. An immediate yes followed by joyful preparation to leave this place and everyone in it behind. But as Freya looked into Thorfinn's ice-blue eyes, saw the vulnerability there that he had never shown to anyone else, she realized that the decision was not simple at all. Somewhere along the way, between organizing records and learning about trade, between conversations that revealed the man beneath the fearsome reputation and moments of unexpected tenderness, she had begun to care for him, not as a captive caring for her captor in some twisted attempt at survival, but as a woman caring for a man who had shown her more respect and recognition than anyone else in her life ever had. If I stay, she said slowly, it will not be as your steward or your possession. It will be as your equal, as someone you have chosen and who has chosen you in return. Can you accept that, Thorfinn? Can you accept a woman who will challenge you and question you and refuse to simply obey without thought? A smile spread across Thorfinn's face, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his harsh features into something almost beautiful. I would accept nothing less. You are not like other women, Freya, and I am not fool enough to want you to be. Your strength and your spirit are what drew me to you in the first place. I would not change them, even if I could." He pulled her closer, and Freya did not resist, allowing herself to lean into his solid warmth. "What about Sven's proposal?" she asked. "He will not take rejection well. There could be war." "Let there be war if it comes to that," Thorfinn replied with a shrug. "I have faced worse threats than Sven Bloodaxe, and if he is foolish enough to attack me over a rejected marriage proposal, then he deserves what he will get. I am tired of making every decision based on fear and strategy, Freya. For once, just this once, I want to choose based on what I actually want rather than what is politically expedient." "Then I choose to stay," Freya whispered. "Not because I must, but because I want to. Because somewhere in the midst of all this chaos and confusion, I have come to care for you, Thorfinn Eriksson. Not the fearsome Jarl or the brilliant trader, but the man who taught me about amber and silk, who shared his painful history with me, who looks at me as if I am more than just useful." Thorfinn's arms tightened around her, and he pressed his forehead against hers, breathing deeply as if trying to memorize this moment. "I will tell Sven tomorrow that I am refusing his offer. There will be consequences, possibly severe ones. Are you certain you can handle what comes next?" "I organized your chaotic records in 3 weeks," Freya replied with a hint of her old defiance. "I stood up to Torstein when he challenged me. I think I can handle a few consequences." Thorfinn laughed, a deep, rich sound that Freya had never heard from him before. "Yes, I suppose you can. Very well then. We face whatever comes together, as equals and as partners. Though I should warn you, Freya, that being my partner is likely to be far more dangerous and difficult than being my steward ever was. I would expect nothing less," Freya said, and then, feeling bold and reckless and more alive than she had felt in months, she stood on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as they learned the shape and taste of each other. But then Thorfinn's hand came up to cup the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of hunger long denied and feelings finally acknowledged. Freya felt as if she were falling and flying simultaneously, all her carefully maintained defenses crumbling away until there was nothing left but the truth of what they felt for each other. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thorfinn rested his forehead against hers again and smiled. "You have undone me completely, Freya. I hope you understand that. The man who took you as payment for a debt is gone, replaced by someone I barely recognize. Someone who believes that perhaps trust and connection are worth the risks they bring." "Good," Freya replied, "because the woman who came here as a captive is gone too, replaced by someone who chooses her own path and her own future. We are both different than we were when this began. Perhaps that is as it should be." The next morning, Thorfinn called a council with his closest advisors to discuss Sven's proposal. Hakon advocated for accepting the alliance, arguing that the strategic benefits outweighed any personal considerations. Several other senior warriors agreed, pointing out that refusing could mean war at a time when Ravensfjord's forces were not at full strength. But Thorfinn listened to all the arguments with patience, and then announced his decision. "I appreciate your counsel, all of you. Your concerns are valid and your strategic thinking sound, but I am refusing Jarl Sven's proposal. I will not marry his daughter, and I will not enter into an alliance built on coercion and threats." The room erupted in protest, voices overlapping as men tried to convince their Jarl to reconsider. Only Hakon remained silent, studying Thorfinn with eyes that saw too much. When the noise finally died down, the old Herseer spoke. "This decision has nothing to do with strategy or politics, does it? This is about her." He gestured toward Freya, who had been standing quietly near the wall. "You have developed feelings for your steward." Thorfinn did not try to deny it. "Yes, I have come to care for Freya, and I have offered to make her my wife if she will accept. Not as a political match or a strategic alliance, but as a genuine union between equals. I know this is not what any of you expected or wanted, but it is my decision to make." The council dissolved into chaos again, some men objecting strenuously, while others seemed simply stunned. But through it all, Thorfinn remained calm and unmoved, his decision made and his resolve unshakable. Finally, Hakon raised his hand for silence. "If this is truly your choice, Jarl Thorfinn, then we will support you as we always have. But you must understand the risks. Sven will not take this rejection lightly. There will be consequences, possibly war. Are you prepared for that? I am, Thorfinn replied firmly, and I believe that Ravensfjord's warriors are more than capable of defending our lands if Sven is foolish enough to attack. We have faced threats before and emerged victorious. We will do so again, if necessary. He turned to Freya then, holding out his hand to her. Come here, Freya. Stand beside me where you belong. Freya crossed the room with her head held high, ignoring the shocked and sometimes hostile stares of the warriors. She took Thorfinn's hand and felt his fingers close around hers with gentle strength. Together they faced the council, united in a way that neither had ever been with anyone else. This woman is no longer my steward or my possession, Thorfinn announced. She is my chosen partner, and soon she will be my wife. Any man who shows her disrespect or treats her with anything less than the honor due to the lady of this household will answer to me personally. This is not open for debate or discussion. It is simply how things will be. The weight of his authority settled over the room like a physical force, and one by one, the warriors nodded their acceptance. They might not understand their Jarl's decision, might not even approve of it, but they knew better than to openly challenge him. Thorfinn Eriksson had never led them astray before, and they would follow him now, even into uncertainty. Later that day, Thorfinn met with Sven and formally declined the marriage proposal. The older Jarl's face darkened with rage, and he made several thinly veiled threats about the consequences of this insult. But Thorfinn stood firm, unmoved by either anger or intimidation. I mean you no disrespect, Jarl Sven, Thorfinn said calmly. Your daughter is surely worthy of any man's regard, but I have already chosen my wife, and I will not dishonor her by setting her aside for political advantage. If you wish to maintain peaceful relations between our territories, I am open to discussing other forms of alliance, but marriage is not possible. Sven left Ravensfjord in a fury, his warriors riding hard back toward their own lands. Hakon watched them go with a troubled expression. He will make trouble for us, Jarl Thorfinn. You know he will. Let him try, Thorfinn replied. I have faced worse threats than an angry Jarl with a wounded pride, and I will not regret my choice, Hakon. For the first time in my life, I am making a decision based on what I want, rather than what fear and strategy dictate. Whatever consequences come from that, I will face them gladly. He turned to Freya, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of anxiety and determination. Are you ready for what comes next? It will not be easy. We will face opposition from many sides, and there will be those who try to use you against me or who see you as a weakness to be exploited. I am ready, Freya replied without hesitation. I did not choose the easy path when I chose to stay with you, Thorfinn. I chose the true path, the one that feels right despite all the logical arguments against it. Whatever challenges we face, we will face them together. As winter deepened and the first snows began to fall on Ravensfjord, preparations began for a wedding that would be unlike any the settlement had ever seen. Not a political alliance or a strategic match, but a genuine union between two people who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and chosen to build something real together despite all the reasons they should not. Freya's family was summoned to Ravensfjord, and they arrived wide-eyed with shock and confusion. Her father could barely comprehend how his daughter, taken as payment for a debt, had somehow become the chosen bride of the most powerful Jarl in the region. Her mother wept with joy and relief, grateful that her daughter had not only survived, but thrived in circumstances that could have destroyed her. Even her foolish brother Olaf, whose theft had set this entire chain of events in motion, seemed humbled and amazed by what his sister had accomplished. I am sorry, he told Freya privately, tears in his eyes. I am sorry for what my stupidity cost you, for the pain I caused our family. Can you ever forgive me? Freya looked at her brother, seeing not the man he was, but the boy he had been, reckless and thoughtless as young men often were. What is done, Olaf. Your actions brought me here, yes, but they also led me to a life I never could have imagined for myself. I will not say I am grateful for the theft or the pain it caused, but I will say that sometimes good things can grow from bad beginnings if we are willing to tend them carefully. The wedding took place on the longest night of winter, a deliberate choice that symbolized how Thorfinn and Freya had found light in the darkest of circumstances. The ceremony was conducted according to ancient tradition, with blessings from the gods and the exchange of rings made from silver melted down from the pendant Thorfinn had given Freya that first day. As they stood together before the assembled household and guests, hands clasped and rings exchanged, Freya felt a sense of rightness that she had never experienced before. This was where she was meant to be, with this man who had seen her strength and valued it, who had offered her freedom and been chosen in return. The path that had brought them together had been twisted and difficult, marked by loss and coercion and pain. But the destination, this moment of commitment and choice and genuine love, made every difficult step worthwhile. "I was given to you as punishment," Freya said during the feast that followed, speaking quietly so only Thorfinn could hear. "But you broke the deal by treating me as more than just payment for a debt. You gave me purpose and respect and eventually your heart. You transformed what should have been my ruin into my salvation." Thorfinn pulled her close, his arms strong and warm around her shoulders. "No, Freya. You transformed yourself through your own strength and intelligence. I simply had the wisdom to recognize your value and the courage to choose love over strategy. We saved each other, I think. Two lonely people who found in each other the connection we both desperately needed but were too afraid to seek." As the feast continued around them and the fire burned bright in the hearth, driving back the winter darkness, Freya allowed herself to finally let go of the fear and resentment she had carried for so long. She was no longer a captive or a possession. She was Freya Thorfinn's daughter, Lady of Ravensfjord, partner to the most feared Jarl in Norway, and a woman who had claimed her own destiny through courage and choice. The spring would bring new challenges, possibly war with Sven Bloodaxe, certainly difficulties and dangers she could not yet imagine. But she would face them all with Thorfinn beside her, as his equal and his chosen companion. Together they would navigate whatever storms came their way, just as they had navigated the storm that had brought them together in the first place. And if the path ahead was uncertain, at least they would walk it together, two souls who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to create their own light.